Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. And today when I say very special, boy howdy do I mean it. I don't ordinarily go ahead and paint named characters for the channel, but with Valoris here, I thought it was worth really taking the extra time. Now what I'm going to show you is mostly dry brushing. You might be a little surprised, but I promise this is all very simple techniques. There's only one or two parts that I've done here which require a little bit of brush control, but everything is essentially designed in such a way that you can come back, fix up your mistakes as easily as possible, and I'm really pleased with the result. It's one that I'd quite happily put on the table. From here, you could take it a little bit further, but I'm quite confident that this is something that most people will be able to achieve with a minimum of fuss. It does use a few more paints than usual, being completely honest, but they will all be listed in the description below, along with the recipe for the base. So without any further mucking around, let's get started. Now, first things first, I want to point out that what you're seeing is not a grievous modeling error. That little gap there in the top, I haven't assembled him with his head. Reason being, it's not just because I wanted to spray the head separately, but because it is quite a difficult angle. You know, there's this feather in the way, there's the extremely high collar. Painting his face is going to be difficult once that is assembled. It's not going to be impossible, but figuring that I hadn't put them together yet, that's much simpler. So I've primed the body first of all in Retributor armor and the head in Wraithbone. Now there's nothing saying that you couldn't just prime the body in a grey or something and give it a couple of coats of Retributor armor from the pot. And same too, you needn't necessarily do the head in Wraithbone. They could just be the same colour. But I'm looking at ways to save time and make this as simple as possible, and genuinely spraying these two different colours is going to make it easier overall. We'll concentrate first of all on painting the body. Even though I've begun by priming this guy in gold, the first thing we're going to do is take a little bit of Retributor armor from the pot and just make sure that any areas which might not have been hit by the primer as thoroughly as I would like, I'm going to get in there with the brush and brighten those up a bit. You'll probably find it's best to do the entire, go over all of the armor with this, so it's a nice even color. You might see it's a little bit warmer, and that's going to be perfect. Once it's had a couple of minutes to dry and settle, it's time to shade over all of the armor. Now which color you use is up to you. I'm going to use here, this is Reichland Flesh Shade, because I want a warm, rosy gold kind of finish. But you can instead use Agrax Earthshade. If you want to see what that looks like, I will link to a speed painting video I did for Stormcast Eternals, which will show you exactly the same result as this gold armor, but using that Agrax Earthshade. Now luckily, this is not terribly difficult. Don't bucket it on too thoroughly though, like once it's on, start shifting around and just work it into the recesses. You don't want this to change the color of the gold too much. But once you've got it on all of the armor, well, funnily enough, we're going to need to leave that to dry, and it will take about 20 minutes to maybe half an hour. Now you'll see that is quite dark by comparison to what we had earlier, but that's perfect. We're going to brighten them up now in two stages with a couple of dry brushes. I have first of all some Sigmarite and a big old brush here. I'm just going to make sure I've not got too much on my brush. And up on the chunky chicken here is a pretty good spot to test out how much your brush is going to leave behind. And you'll see on camera it's not going to make a huge amount of difference, but in reality it's kind of like putting a layer paint over the top of that gold, and that this is our stage 2, if you will. So you can be fairly generous with this, and just pass over the gold areas a few times to buff them up a bit. And you'll see, especially on the shield, we very quickly get a nice warm gold color, but which is gold rather than orange. So I'm going to dry brush all of the gold armor, and yeah, we'll come back and get a look at what that looks like in a couple of seconds. Once you've brightened up that gold, we're going to do our highlights, and we're going to stick to dry brushing for this. I have one of my little makeup brushes, though a small Citadel dry brush is about the same size, and some Necron compound. I'm going to start with these. What I want to do is catch just the edges of the golden armor. So I'm going to come predominantly dry brushing downwards. And I'm not terribly fussed if some of this looks a little pale. You'll see very quickly we get quite a sharp silvery edge to these gold areas. So concentrating on parts which are going to really catch that light, for example, this doublet down the front of his tabard here, very lightly flicking along the edges to pick up. Now, you can very quickly go overboard with this, if I'm honest, but I do quite like a very sharp silver edge to my gold. Matter of personal preference, that one, but however much you want to apply, now's the time. After a couple of passes around, you'll have a nice shiny gold. It will look a little bit chalky in some places, but not to worry. When we varnish it, that's going to bring that all together and bump it up a little bit, make it look shiny again. Now we'll spin him around, and I'm actually going to base coat the Aquila on the back of his cloak. Reason being, this is going to be a little easier to do this now than while we're fussing around with the red and all that carry on. And what I'm using for this is just a little bit of Ushabti bone. Now, you could easily use, what is it called, Morghast bone or something similar, but as you'll see, a couple of coats will be necessary here. This is just going to save us time versus trying to painstakingly paint in the Aquila over the red instead. So we'll start here. Once you're satisfied with the coverage there, it's time to spin him around, and we're going to start applying the red leather color that's quite prevalent on this dude. I figured that on the inside of his cape and his gloves and such, all of the pictures I've seen on the website, the workshop website, suggest it's made from the same leather material, so I'm going to just use this same color for all of those areas. What I've got, this is a Vallejo color. This is burnt red, and it's very similar. You'll see going on, it is extremely similar to Doombull Brown. But you'll also see the coverage on this is magic. So what I'm going to do is go around all the areas I want to be that darker red leather sort of color. Areas like up under his cape here, just take your time, approach him from a couple of different angles as you do. If you do hit any areas of gold, a little bit of auric armor gold will normally help you tidy that up. But I am also going to switch to a much smaller brush to reach some of these areas. One of the reasons I'll ordinarily suggest a color which covers better is for a situation like this, where you've got to dance around a little and reach in between some areas to really get the coverage that you want, but you don't want to risk having to come back to the same place over and over, because the more brush strokes you spend in an area, the more likely you're going to make a mess as you lift your brush away. And as you see, that's a really nice substitute for Doombull Brown, which would probably have taken me 3 or 4 coats in some areas. I'm going to move on now to some Mephiston Red, and I've added just a tiny bit of water to this, same as I have everything else so far. What we're going to do is start getting in, oh my goodness, concentrating. This is always easier when you haven't got the camera in the way, as I'm fond of pointing out. But we're going to paint around the outside of the Aquila, first of all, and once we've got that area blocked out a little more safely, I'm going to swap to a larger brush and paint in the back of his cloak, and this stuff at the front here, beep, 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 in Mephiston Red. So, same as with the others, this is a slightly time-consuming method. Let's hold them upside down. Something to bear in mind, you are manipulating a three-dimensional object. Sometimes it's easier to approach from a different angle. Once you've outlined the basic shape of the Aquila, you can then switch to a larger brush if you're comfortable with using one, and we'll start applying this to the rest of the cape. Obviously slowing down once I get near any edges, and this is why I mention if you do want to use a smaller brush, again, whatever's most comfortable for you is really the correct answer here. Now that will take some patience, and you'll see, well, the eagle's not its best. I have always found it easier though, when you're doing these patterns, to lay down the base color first, sort of paint them in, so the red areas that I've just done, and then we can do some tidy up if necessary. So I've gone back to this minus Ushabti bone again, and I'm going to take the time now to tidy up and straighten up these little red splatters. Now that's not difficult to do, but it is time consuming, and I'll be honest, it's probably one of the reasons I don't have a custodian army. We're going to move on now. We are going to do more to the red and all of this stuff back here, obviously. But before we do that, we're going to lay down some more of the base coats elsewhere. So I have some Vallejo black, and this is going to be for the same reason that I used the burnt red earlier. The coverage on this will make our lives so much easier. So, funnily enough, everywhere that is going to be black, and you'll see just how quickly that goes on. Oh, life is good. Don't worry too much if you do hit these little filigree parts. If you hit them with some black, we can touch them up a little bit later. But if you can avoid them, that's good too. At the same time, now I'm going to be 100% honest. I'm not looking forward to painting this bloody lightning thing. But I know full well, love you all though I do, if I don't paint the lightning on this, you're going to lose your minds. So, because I love you all, you're all very important to me, I am going to paint the lightning and show you one way of doing it, and regret it deeply the entire time. Anyhow, let's get around the rest of the miniature. Any little black bits, these hoses on his ankles, for example. Yep, have a look at the product page on the website. The 360-degree view of this is actually super useful. Let's get these bits done. I did mention that ordinarily I like to leave my cleanup stages to last, but since it's relevant now, grab a little bit of Liberator Gold and you can tidy up any of the filigree where you've gone crazy with the black. Now I always think the black adds a huge amount to this thing starting to really look done. I'm turning now to Iron Hand Steel. I want quite a bright silver color for most of my metallic areas. And we're going to shade this in two different ways when we finally come to doing a little bit more work with the shades. But for now, we can content ourselves with just one color. You may find in some areas, especially in big flat areas like this magazine here, you're probably going to need to give it a second coat, but that is up to you to decide. Now for these last couple of colors, it's not going to matter too much in what order you apply them. So I'm going to stick to his weapon for now, and let's just get him there. I have some Jucaro orange, and we're going to paint that over the ribbed sections, which I'm guessing are part of the grip. For the lion pelt, we're going to use Zandri dust, and same as always, I'm going to use quite a large brush for this, and then when I need to, swap on down to a smaller one. Painting his face and all this, just one quick coat over everything. And then on animal products, we're going to move on to the feathers. And for this, I have Corax White. Now this, you are going to need to shake the absolute dickens out of. As always, I recommend having an agitator and a little bit of Lamy and Medium in there to help that stop from going gummy. But when it works, my goodness, that is white. You know, really easy to do. Now a little Calidor Sky will go on to any of the gems that I want to be quite bright blue. You can of course use Macragge blue if that's what you've got. There's no really right answer to what colour these things ought to be. I just think Calidor Sky's got a nice rich colour to it. And then finally in the realm of base coats for the armour, I've got a little Mechanicus Standard Grey, and honestly, Games Workshop, like guys, I know this is cool and all, but if you could stop putting action rocks on bases, that would be fantastic. Now once at last you have finished all of those base coats, my goodness, there is a lot going on this dude, and done any tidy up that you need to, it's time to move on to dry brushing him again. Now I have here some Tyrant Skull, and this is going to go over quite a bit. I'm going to use a brush which has a wedge tip to it, and you'll see why in a minute. This is the Army Painter Small Dry Brush. I'll start off first of all by just essentially testing my brush on the lion pelt, because that's going to be an easy spot to see how much paint I'm leaving behind, and on this part you can't really overdo it. So once I've gotten some of that off my brush and I see how much is being left, I'm going to move along the red, and yeah, a few passes there like that. Then I'm going to flip them around, and I'll also do the same on the darker brown. You'll see this will require a few passes. I'm probably going to need to go back and get some fresh paint. But the reason for the wedge tip is that I can spin them around. The lighting for this is tragically not very handy, but turn the brush ends like so, and flick down into that area where I would struggle to reach to highlight otherwise. Like so. So what I'm going to do now is, very carefully, so now I'm going to dry brush all of this red, catching the high points on the red, funnily enough. And we'll also do along pretty much everywhere. If you're worried about this leaving behind a chalky texture, don't worry too much, because same as with everything, we can come back and tidy it up when we need to. Now I can hear some of you already writing up the comments telling me that, ooh, that doesn't look good. And I'll be honest, I've done that for a reason. Because this is one where it's very easy to go overboard, but luckily it's also one which is super easy to fix up. So I've gone back to a little bit of Mephiston Red. What I'm going to do is, with this slightly thinner than I ordinarily would, I'm just going to block out some of the areas where there is a little too much of this dry brush. So what I can get here is closer to a nice sharp highlight with a little bit of fade, but without having to have a super steady hand. So what I'll do now is, with my Mephiston Red and my burnt red from earlier, anywhere that I don't want, all of this dry brush, I can tidy up. So here on the front, for example, you'll get a nice sharp line, if I can get them in focus, goodness me. But as easy as this, you can get rid of any excess. Now that probably won't take long, and I would suggest here that you're going to want to trust in your dry brush a little more than you might think. All right? You don't need to be too brutal with this. What I'm going to do is now turn to some Carroburg Crimson, and I'm going to paint this over all of the red. So we'll start at the front because this will be the easiest. Let's just paint this and make sure we're letting it get into any recesses. I will probably swap to a smaller brush fairly quickly, but you'll see very early on how this ties everything together, darkens down that Tyrant skull a bit, and gives us lots of nice rich red shading. I'm going to swap on down to a smaller brush for some of these areas, but you'll see I've already gone over some of that beige with this red. So we are going to need to do another stage of tidy up with it on the beige, but not to worry. Again, we're looking for the way that will make this as easy as possible. Now that's not quite dry, but I think you can see you get a much smoother transition of color without losing any of the richness of the red, and we've still used just the same dry brush color for all of that. So I'm going to turn now at last. I know you've been waiting for it. The Agrax Earthshade comes out. I'm going to paint this over all of the weapon, with the exception of the big chicken that's already there. I'm also going to paint this over the inside of the cape, so take your time getting in there. And as well, you'll find it easiest at this stage to give the feathers a quick Agrax as well. Now we're getting somewhere. Now, in retrospect, it probably would have been better to leave the tidy up stage on the Aquila until I'd come to this point, but live and learn. What we'll do now is go back to that Ashanti bone again, and this is why I mentioned, the benefit of hindsight. But let's just carefully tidy up these edges, get rid of those little red splashes. And one other important step, let's not forget our lion's little black nose. Now, you could use a dark brown here if you wanted to instead, but honestly, I think we've got enough colors to be working on already that it doesn't hurt too much just to stick to one that we've already got here. We arrive then finally to one of the last shades we're going to apply on the body. I think it might actually be the last, and that is Seraphim Sepia. Grab yourself a nice big old brush, and we're going to apply this first of all over the lion. And with a smaller brush, we'll apply the same to the Aquila itself. Now, it is up to you if you actually want to apply it over all of the Ashanti bone. You could instead just paint it very carefully into the recesses near the edges of the Aquila. It's up to you. You could also go down the route of applying maybe a contrast mix. If you want a more yellow finish here, make it look a little more gold, but it is up to you. I'm just going to very slowly work my way around, a little bit of shade at a time. Now really I should wait until that whole thing is dry, but I'm getting impatient now, so I have some flayed one flesh. What I'm going to do is, I've watered that down just a little more than usual. I'm going to pick out just near the edges, at the top of the little wing parts, with some of this. If you wanted to take this a stage further, you could get some flayed one flesh and just highlight the extreme edges, but I think that's fine for now. I'm not too fast. I don't want to go any further. That is quite enough. What I've got next of all, this is a rough half and half mix of wildwood and contrast medium, and I'm going to apply this over the feathers, or at least most of the feathers. So if I hold them sideways like this is probably going to be easier. I'll start from roughly, yeah, that'll do, about a third of the way up the feather, and just fill that in with some contrast. Do the other side. If I do hit the little spine section in the feather in the center, not too worried, because I can hit that with some white later on if I want to brighten it up. And the cool thing with the mix is if you want to do a stronger fade towards the top of the feathers, you can very easily just paint not quite far as down, not quite far as down. Oh man, it's been a long day, I tell you. I promise I can speak. I promised I would, so let's do the lightning effect on the axe. I'm going to start with a little bit of Thunderhawk blue. And first of all, I'm going to scrub this into one of my dry brushes. What I want to do is just lightly flick at the edges, just to give us a preliminary highlight. You'll see this doesn't take very much. And if you want to, you can leave a little bit more on your brush than you normally would, or even just stipple into the axe head a little bit, so that the cutting edge is a little more blue than the inside of the head. Now that's a good start, and it gives us a little more of that power effect towards the edge of the axe, but we do need to use Thunderhawk Blue to go around this little dealy bopper thing. What would you call that? The power node? Well, let's call it that. So we'll start by painting very carefully around there. And then from this point, what you can do is to start drawing out little lines. Now the pattern that this makes will of course be up to you. My recommendation as always while you're painting is just have a little bit of paint on your brush at a time. All right, you do not need to overload your brush. So what I'm going to do now, this is Lothern Blue, and I'm going to aim towards the center of some of these joins, like where my lines overlap. I'm going to put a little Lothern Blue to make them stand out a bit more. I'll tell you what, if you are more interested in doing this than I am, you'll probably have a better looking lightning pattern. Mine is, I am not good at this, so have a practice yourself as well, and I guarantee you'll get a better result than I've got here. Once you've got all your zaps and scratches looking the way you want, grab some Ulthuan Grey. What I'm going to do is the same thing again, but concentrating right in the center of where these lines overlap. So little zap marks here and there. Now I think there my technique is probably lacking, but the colors I'm pretty sure are right. And this would take nothing, if you're doing it yourself, to just black over some of those areas, tighten the scheme up a little. It's up to you, but I'm happy enough with that to call that done. What I've got now is some Terminatus stone, and I'm just going to go over lightly the lion's fur again, because I think that could stand, to brighten up just a little bit. With a little bit of Nuln Oil, I swear I didn't forget the silver details. Anywhere that you want to delve these down a little, introduce a bit more depth, you can add your Nuln Oil here. And now finally, in the realm of not strictly necessary, but will look very cool if you do, I have here some Vallejo Model Air Chrome, and this, my goodness, you'll see what I'm going to do with this in a second. I can use the side of my brush, rather than the tip, just to hunt out some of the areas where I really want that nice sharp silver edge to sing. So anywhere that you want super shiny gold, just ding a little bit of this on there. Not strictly necessary, but will look awesome. Particularly, I'd say, up on the shield here, because this is an area where you're likely to pick up a little bit of grime and some dings while you are painting other areas. Now up to that point, all that remains is to take him outside and hit him with a matte varnish. I'm going to use Munitorum varnish. Ordinarily I turn to a pure matte, but Munitorum varnish is a very slight satin, and what you'll get instead is a very faint glossiness to all of these surfaces, which will really make that gold sing. Once I've done that, I'm going to pop a base on them, and I'm going to keep that deliberately quite simple. From there, I'm going to go ahead and we'll get started painting on the head, So I'm going to varnish this dude, do his base, and we'll pop back and start painting his face. Now when it comes to painting his head, it is a little macabre, but I swear beheading him makes him so much easier to paint. Now this one is pretty simple. I've started from that Wraithbone primer, and what I've got here is some Cadian flesh tone. We can apply this just over his face. It is not too difficult to this at all. If you do hit his hair, well, whoopsie doodle, it doesn't matter. One quick coat of this will probably do the job, but if you do get any streakiness, you can come back and apply a second. Now I did come back and give him a second coat. Honestly, at this point, with all the work you've put into everything else, why rush him? A little bit of Reikland flesh shade can go all over the skin now, and we'll make sure to paint that straight into his eye sockets to make sure that we don't miss those. While I've still got a little bit of Cadian flesh tone on my palette, what I'm going to do is just blop over most of his face again, leaving that darker, grumpier red in the recesses. The best part about this is that it will help frame the edge of his hair, so when we come time to paint that, that's going to be a little bit easier. And swap on down to a smaller brush. I'm using one of the small layer brushes, and a little bit of Kislev flesh. What we can do with this is start sketching out some of the high points on his face. So the bridge of his nose is a good place to start with this. His eyebrows. And we'll do a couple of little lines across this grumpy bit. I got to stop laughing to do it. And then with just a tiny bit of flayed one flesh, what we're going to do is poke in the very corner of his nose to make that stand out a bit. Bridge there. Corners of his brows. Not very much here at all. Now don't forget what I always do, which is the fact he has ears. Remember to paint the edges of those too. I have a little Skaven Blight dinge, and I'm going to use this to paint in his hair. So to play it safe with this, your best way to do it is to start close to the edge of the hair and drag backwards away from his face. Then when you're confident, you can push the tip of your brush up a little closer to the edge you want to create. But remember, you want to always be painting away from that detail you do not want to mess up. So I'm going to paint in all of his beard and his mustache and all this with a couple of coats of Skaven Blight dinge. Now we'll get a little bit of Ulthuan grey, although you could use a straight white or something like grey seer here instead if you wanted. And this Angler's head, this one's a funny old one to try and show you. I'm going to start by drawing some straight lines, just flicking my brush down and away from the edge of the hair. As that starts to collect a little bit further back, what I'll do is start joining them up, making that colour a little more strident towards the centre of his head. Now that will take going back over the same area a couple of times, but you'll build up the colour and it will look really good when it's finished. So as always, a little patience and it will look just fine. I'm now just going to tidy up around the edges with a little bit of black and some silver. At this stage you could glaze the skin with a couple of other colours, but I want to keep this deliberately quite simple. I'm going to go ahead and varnish him. Now this is a brush-on varnish. Varnish Plus is the name of it, from a group called Instar. Now they do a wonderful, this is super matte. Like when this dries, this is going to look just so flat. It's brilliant. Once I've done that, I'm going to let this settle, dry properly, and then I'll be able to pluck it off the end of the this little spike I've got him on, and I will pop it into the socket on the armour. I'm going to use a little dot of PVA in there just to glue this in place because I don't want any super glue just in case it frosts up the side of his head. But at last, let's get a look at this fella once everything is all complete. And there finally, with his head assembled, finally in his body, base done, varnishes applied, Trajann Valoris is complete. And from here I think you could see there's a ton of different things you could do if you wanted a slightly nicer result. But the purpose here is to show you that, honestly, the basic stuff will continue to work for your characters. You don't have to reinvent the wheel just because you want to paint your HQ and have them come out looking pretty cool. Like I mentioned, this does use a few more paints than I ordinarily would suggest, but if you were painting ordinary troops like your Custodes, then don't worry too much. You can skip out a few of these paints and it won't matter. Now, I do thoroughly recommend looking up some of the other guides on YouTube for how to paint this dude, because I found it really interesting when sort of doing my research on how different people approached things. There is no two ways alike. It's really interesting that everybody's got their own recipe, and I thought that was quite neat being able to bring my own variation on that to the table, and why not check out and see if there's something else which you might adapt to what I've shown you here. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Fred, and Jimmy. Your support lets me do this stuff, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. And I tell you what, he goes around each time, and I think that lightning effect is glowing on me. Growing on me. Anyhow, folks, thank you very much for your time, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.